Hello, everyone. Thank you for visiting our paper on temporal granularity in self-supervised video representation learning. My name is Ray, and this work is conducted in collaboration with Google Research, Cornell University, and the University of Copenhagen. First of all, our method work on self-supervised video representation learning, which has been densely studied in the past few years. We first list a few representative related work. So for example, now we got two works. The first is broadening your views for self-supervised video representation learning, which is from DeepMind. What they are doing is like they try to enforce the feature of randomly selected short clip to be similar within the same entire video. And the second paper is a large-scale study on self-supervised spatial temporal representation learning, which is from Facebook AI Research. And the algorithm is like sampling multiple clips from the same video and enforcing the features to be similar between each two clips. So we copy of their two teasers to represent their algorithms here. The major motivation of our paper is like we call the learning objective in the state-of-the-art methods as temporally persistent learning, which means the features learned are persistent across different temporal locations of the whole video. Our question is like, is temporal persistent learning the ultimate answer for self-supervised video representation learning? We actually argue that this objective is not always provable. The previous strong performances are mostly achieved on commonly used video benchmarks of action recognition, which does not mean like the feature learned is suitable for all video tasks. So, in our paper, we want to introduce a concept of feature temporal granularity, which describes how temporally fine-grained the feature should be. So now, maybe the term of feature temporal granularity can be a bit abstract, so we'll use an illustration example in the next slide to explain it. So here, for example, consider the following illustration example. Within the same short video, suppose we can define two tasks. For example, we can define a task called event boundary detection. So it is obvious like when we are trying to divide manually of this 10-second short video into a few events, we can see like the first event is like the welcome slogan on a wall, and the second event is like the food in the kitchen, and the third event is like we see appetizers in the living room, and finally we meet with our friends. So for this task, event boundary detection, it actually calls for temporally fine-grained features so that the model should be aware of the temporal content shifts that is able to detect the kind of boundaries between these different events. However, if we define another different task called video level recognition, so our aim is only letting our model to produce one unified label for all parts of the video. So maybe it's called attending a horse warming party. So this kind of task actually requires model to robustly predict the target label based on some sample clips from the video. And thus, this kind of task actually preferring coarse-grained features. So in light of our observations, we define the temporal granularity as describing how fine-grained the temporally of our learner features. Then the next question are, how can we design a method to learn features with varying granularities? And, if possible, could the learning of coarse and fine-grained features to be integrated into a simple and unified framework? So here, we propose our method. From left to right, it indicates the overall working pipeline of our method. First, we do sampling. The way we do our temporal sampling is like we randomly sample a long clip from a given video and a short clip that lies inside the duration of the long clip. We'll explain later about the motivation and the mechanism of doing so. And secondly, when we have sampled these two clips, we feed them into a same video encoder to generate two embeddings. And we use different projection heads to project them into different embedding spaces. The separate embedding spaces include one fine-grained embedding space using dense contrastive learning to learn temporally fine-grained features, and another is an embedding space with coarse-grained learning objective. They only use global contrastive learning, which is quite similar like other works in the community. Then we may explain a bit more about temporal sampling. So we apply a long-short sampling strategy. So why previous sampling method does not work? because previous works typically sample two short clips within the same length independently, aiming at learning temporal persistent features. However, this common strategy is not always suitable for learning temporally fine-grained features since it enforces non-overlapped clips to have similar features. So we adopt a method called long-short sampling because when the overlap, we want to only pull together the features with temporal overlap, and also in the context. If two clips are at the same time, it fallbacks to only spatial augmentation. And we know like if we want to only apply spatial augmentation and ignore temporal concepts, actually the video representation learning will fall back to image representation learning. So our proposed long-short sampling strategy ensures the overlapping of the two clips and also preserve rich context. After we have introduced spatial augmentation, after we have introduced temporal augmentation, our spatial augmentation just follow with the previous literature called spatial temporal video representation learning. So we just use temporal consistent spatial augmentation. And we will do a bit temporal aggregation. I think for this kind of details, you can find in our paper if you are interested. Also, you can email me if you have further questions. For the temporal persistent feature learning space, it is actually quite easy. After temporal aggregation, we got one vector representing the whole clip. So temporal persistent feature learning aims at pulling together feature vectors of the long and short clip, regardless of their temporal duration. And more importantly, this is our temporally fine-grained feature learning. So after temporal aggregation, we get a few feature vectors representing the whole clip. Each feature vector represents a feature of a certain time duration. We call the feature vectors representing similar time durations in long and short clip as corresponding features. And temporally fine-grained learning aims at pulling together only corresponding features. This objective will make the learned features to be discriminative in time, resulting in more fine-grained representations. So this is what we do. And our final loss function is a linear combination of these two loss functions. We can see like, actually by easily adjusting alpha, the loss weight factor, we can learn features of specified temporal granularity. We would mainly use two representation settings. The first one is alpha equals 0.0. Now we only have the persistent objective, so we call it TEG-PS. TEG is in short for temporal granularity, and PS is in short for persistent feature. And another representative example we use is alpha equals 0.9. Now we mostly have fine-grained feature objective, so we call it TEG, FG. FG is for fine-grained. Now we have introduced the concept of temporal granularity, and we have introduced our method. We would like to cover the evaluation benchmarks. How do we verify the effectiveness of the proposed feature temporal granularity? What we do is we actually incorporate emerging and classic video benchmarks to conduct a comprehensive study. Our benchmark consists of three major aspects. First one is like benchmarks intuitively require fine-grained features. And second is benchmark intuitively require coarse-grained features. And then finally, it is benchmarks we are curious to explore, like temporal-heavy action recognition and spatial temporal action localization. So we will mainly introduce our fine-grained tasks like event classification on VidSitu benchmark. So this is a benchmark consists of movie clips, and each of the movie clips is divided into 5 events, and each event is annotated with a verb to describe the most silent action happening in the event. The boundaries between the events are determined by human perception, thus it's very hard to be determined by off-the-shelf shot detectors. So we first do qualitative evaluation. What we are doing is like we randomly select videos in a validation set, sample the middle clip for each event, and calculate the cosine similarity between the feature of clips. So we can say like for the example at the left side, so we have 5 different verbs or events, which is annotated with verb of yield, watch, point, kneel, and write. And we can say like when we are using the persistent feature, actually, despite the different annotations or different verb descriptions, actually the feature similarity are quite high between each other. And when we try to switch into temporally fine-grained feature, actually you can see like the cosine similarity is much lower. It means like our fine-grained learning objective can learn some fine-grained features across time, while the persistent feature can only enforce the videos, the events to have similar representations, regardless of their different semantics. The second example may be also very representative. So we have two same annotations for the first two clips. They are smoke. And we have three same annotations for the last three clips about talk. We can see like for persistent feature, the gap between the talk, smoke, and talk are actually quite small, while it is obvious like for fine-grained feature, is actually the gap is quite large. So this qualitative evaluation actually indicates like our method can actually um, learn a feature representation from coarse grain to fine grain or from persistent to fine grain. And we do more in-depth study on this temporal granularity. So previously, we only adopt two settings of alpha. One is 0.0 and another is 0.9. So we just use more settings and we choose two representative tasks. The first is the event classification, and the second is action recognition on a common user data benchmark of kinetics. We can see like when we are trying to going to increase alpha, actually it means the loss granular, the feature are more and more fine-grained in temporally. We can observe increasing of performance trend on the residual event classification benchmark, but we can also observe a drastically decreasing performance trend for kinetics. So it means like different video understanding tasks actually requires feature of different granularity, temporal granularity. And we will mainly cover another benchmark called event boundary detection on kinetics, GBD. So this is an emerging benchmark and taking more fine-grained boundaries on kinetics videos. So actually, the results are in expectation. So you can see like we compare our method between TEGPS persistent feature and TEGFG for fine-grained feature. You can see like for these tasks requiring fine-grained features, actually our fine-grained learning actually have much better performance than other persistent learning methods. And we also conduct benchmarking on action recognition on kinetics because it is the most classic benchmark for action recognition. Here, because kinetics only requires video level understanding or video level classification, we can see like the persistent feature is actually going to have better performance. And then finally, we investigate a few interesting benchmarks like action recognition on Diving 48 and something V2. So Diving 48 is collected from diving sports videos and aims at doing classification between turning one round, two rounds, etc. And something V2 aims at human-object interaction containing classes of push something away from something. These two datasets are very interesting testbeds for our proposed temporal granularity. We are interested like, do this task require temporal fine-grained features or coarse-grained features? Actually, our study shows like for this kind of two datasets, persistent features actually are preferred. We will conduct more detailed analysis in the future. And then finally, we work on like spatial temporal action localization and ALVA kinetics. And this is also an important task we consider in video understanding. And in this spatial temporal action localization task, we also find like temporal persistent features perform better than temporal fine-grained features. And also we find like self-supervised learning is also much better than supervised pre-training. So we do a summary of our experiments and also our paper. We have three categories of benchmarks. The first benchmarks intuitively require fine-grained features, and we do find like they are verified by experiments like fine-grained features are preferred. These examples include event classification and event boundary detection. And the second is about benchmarks intuitively require coarse-grained feature like scene-heavy action recognition on kinetics, UCF, and HMDB. We find like the performance is verified by experiments like coarse-grained features are preferred. And then finally, for some uncertain benchmarks we are curious to explore, like temporal heavy action recognition or spatial temporal action localization, we find like coarse-grained features are preferred. The high reason may be need more further detailed analysis. So this is a major outcome of our paper. And finally, we achieve competitive performance or state-of-the-art performance on all benchmarks. Thank you for listening. If you have any more questions, feel free to drop me an email. Thank you.